Okay, so the demonstration I'm giving now is making your hand stamp. So we're using a composite. It's a blick material called Safety Cut. It cuts really, really easily, but it also has like a nice squishiness to it. And that enables us to use it in a less traditional way than we would other relief applications. So we're gonna make designs on newsprint in graphite. And it's a good idea to go over your graphite maybe a couple of times so it's pretty heavy because this accepts graphite really easily, but it's gonna be better if you have more than you need. So I wanted to do a rotational tessellation and I knew that was gonna cause me to need a little bit more space. So I broke my drawing down to 3 inches so that it could expand out to 4 inches. So I'm just gonna place this so that the parameters of the drawing are within, let's see here, so that the parameters of the drawing are within the actual block. I'm just taking a little bit of duct tape to tape that down on one side. Tried to use masking tape on this rubber and it just doesn't seem to do the trick. And I'm just gonna gently use a bone folder to go over this. It's important that you don't push really hard. If you push too hard, you're gonna spread out your line and you just want like a really perfect transfer. So lighter the better. And you can lift it often to see what your progress is so that you can kind of tell where you might need to do a little bit more rubbing. A lot of times I'll actually just use my fingernails to rub these on as well. If you're concerned about it moving, like with just the single piece of tape, you could always go with 2 pieces of tape and that helps as well. What this also does is it offsets the imagery. So say you want text or symbols in your stamp, right? You can draw them forward on here and then they will automatically go backwards on here so that when they print, they'll actually be forward. So it produces an offset image for you. Now you're gonna get a bigger piece of this, so it's not like you're gonna be stuck to this smaller size. I just cut my piece down to a square because I knew I wanted something that I could use for a tessellation. So you can design your stamp to be much bigger if you'd like to. So my next step here is that I'm gonna go in there with kind of a softer pencil, not a super bold pencil like a 6B or anything. I'll probably use like a kind of a duller, maybe a 4B or a 2B, because I don't want to scratch the surface, but I do want to get my lines a little more heavy. You can use a Sharpie, but this is kind of like a powdery surface to some degree, and for whatever reason, Sharpie it doesn't work very well. You can try it. What happens is you'll get a good line for a little bit, and then the dusty business that's on this rubber kind of like fills up the Sharpie, and it makes it to where it's hard to actually draw in there. Gel pens will probably work pretty well. But we're gonna be using relief tools to cut out this pattern, and then we actually cut the piece out itself, and we're gonna make something that we can use as a stamp. So the next step will be, after I'm cutting, demonstrating how we turn this into a hand stamping mechanism. All right, so I've transferred my imagery over. What I've done is I've taken the time to actually go in and carve out the stuff that I don't want to print. I'm not 100% certain exactly how it's going to print, but after I proof it, I'll decide whether or not I need to make any changes to that. So I'm going to go through some carving demonstration, kind of talk about how you're going to proceed with that. I don't always go in with the Sharpie marker and mark in my marks or my lines, but sometimes I find it really helpful just to clarify some things. Like for this border, right? I wanted it very clear, clean, easy to understand because I want to have a good outline around my pattern. It's going to help with the way that it prints. So I strongly encourage that before you even start with your design, that you take just a scrap piece of this safety cut rubber and create some problems for yourself to solve, right? So like if you're going to shade or you're going to create curvilinear line work and things like that, get familiar with how you need to work with the gouge to make that happen. Typically, when you're doing relief applications, you want to use some safety equipment to hold your block in place, but this is so rubbery that it holds itself pretty well. You do not have to use much force at all to cut through this stuff. It's super soft. That's why it's called safety cut. In the end of your cutting tool, you're going to find all the blade assortments in there. And it's a good idea to practice each of those as well to get a good feel for the types of marks that it's going to make. I can tell you that this blade is not always very useful in these applications. Usually for harder substrates, this knife can do things like give you really tiny lines if you can cut it in a V. So typically you're going to be using what we call gouges, right? So we have sharp gouges, little detail gouges, like this number 1 gouge is going to make a very small mark, very small white mark. Your number 2, which is probably my favorite, creates a nice clean line. It's a little bit wider, it's not as shallow. Then you've got some U gouges. This is a little bit more U-shaped, so it's going to cut a wider channel than the number 2. And then you will have a much wider gouge, right? So this is good for areas that you need to take a lot of information away. So once you select the tool that you want to use, you're going to release the chuck, which is basically just unscrewing it. Inside of this, you've got a ball that's attached to a little collar, and you have a loose collar inside of there. It's kind of hard to see, but you want to get familiar with loading these up. It's a 2-sided blade situation. I'm going to go with my number 3 here, right? So you've got the sharp side. You don't want to put that inside of this. It will destroy the blade. You want to use the rounded side to stick inside the blade, or inside the chuck rather. So you want to place that just inside. It should be touching both the ball collar and the loose collar. That way when you screw it, it tightens it inside of there, right? When you're cutting, always cut away from yourself, right? You can injure yourself quite a bit. Some people prefer to use kind of a pincher. Some people prefer to use this sort of a motion. I'm just going to practice leaving my lines alone. For me, it's easier to remove the white areas and leave the black areas. I've seen some of my students that think better the other way, where they're like, okay, I just need to think about removing the black. I don't know, for me it makes more sense to leave the black because that's exactly how it's going to ink up. Practice doing some cuts where you're needing to get into precise areas and create what are called stop cuts. If I'm going to try to cut toward this line, I really want to keep that line there. I have to be cognizant of the fact that this line is going to stop me. That's when you might want to do a stop cut. What I like to do for stop cuts is use a sharp X-Acto and I sink. Not super deep, but deep enough to where when I meet that, I can pop that out without having to stop and round things off. And what that provides me is a nice clean separation in there. Some people like to use the X-Acto knife. Like when I'm working with these tiny little areas, I'll use an X-Acto because I want that crisp cross-hatching look. So I'm just kind of gently beveling in, maybe, I don't know, a couple of centimeters. And after I've done that, then I can go in with a gouge. I might even be able to like flex it just a little bit so that I can get some cut underneath. And you saw that I flexed it quite a bit and it cracked my piece, right? So that's why we experiment. That way it's not messing up the good one. So yeah, practicing these sorts of things. A lot of times people have a hard time with curvilinear because if you move your hand around like that, when you move your hand around, it kind of like creates straight marks on there. So what I like to do instead is move the block, right? So like if I want a really good clean line in here, I'm going to start and I'm just going to move my block as I'm gently sliding through because I want to control that curvilinear mark. So think about your strategy when you're doing this, right? You're not going to keep the orientation of your block the same way every time. You really want to focus in too, because if you make a mistake, that's it. You're stuck with it. You can't glue this stuff back in, right? You just have to make your mistakes work for you if that's how it ends up. So once you have everything cut, if you want to test to see, one last thing about your tool, it's not a good idea to keep your blade inside of here, okay? When you're done working, you really want to take all your blades out and keep them in the protective handle area. When you do that, make sure that you're placing them with the non-sharp side down, okay? Otherwise, you're going to be dulling those tips of the blades. And of course, you'll have to let me know if you have a dull blade of any kind, and I can help you with that. But I like to put those in there and keep them away and keep them safe. That way, you know, if I accidentally drop this tool or something, I'm not going to chip off a corner. If I, you know, have it out here and I just like ran my hand into it, you know, I've got blood on my surface and I don't want that, right? So get in the habit of just keeping a clean, tidy environment. So once I have everything cut here, if I do want to see like what it's going to print like, I can take a Sharpie and I can gently glide over the surface because I don't want it to slide into the other areas, right? That's going to show me how it's going to print. Like if I decided I didn't want some of those extra little markings, I could change that before I got to the actual printing. But I think I'm pretty happy with what I've got right now. Yeah, I like the eyeball quite a bit there. Looks like I have a little extra chaff that I didn't pull out, so I'll have to get that before I'm done. Okay, so what we're doing is we're turning it on its head. The idea is that I know what the information is going to be when it prints. I can hold it from the back and I can line it up on any element of paper that I want to so that I can really control where it goes. So it's very similar to the concept of these, well, it's almost exactly like the concept of these cast pieces here. Like I got these from the Goodwill. So really hard, clean rubber. You can ink these up and stamp them exactly where you want. So it provides you a lot more latitude when it comes to that. The cool thing about stuff like this, and we'll be doing some of this in this class, is that yeah, you can hand cut stuff, but if you find textures or you find objects that you like and they're kind of low relief, we can cast those with silicone so that we're basically sort of taking almost like a photocopy of an image of something and we're creating a stamp out of it, right? So there's a million possibilities. Like you could treat this in a collage format as well. Like this is just a huge broccoli leaf out of my garden, you know? What if I had a bunch of other cool things that I kind of sort of assembled together and then I poured silicone over the top and I made this very unique sort of almost holograph type stamp. This is a lot longer process though. A lot of curing, different things to make the substrate stronger. Okay, so what we do is we want to cut the form out, right? And that's why it was important for me to have this extra nice, strong, sturdy mark out here. So I'm probably going to err on the side of safety when I cut this. Like I'm going to probably cut and leave a little more than I normally would, because I know there's really no going back once I've cut. I'm gonna get pretty close in here though. I wouldn't try to cut it all out like in one go. I would cut it in pieces to be strategic, right? And when you do cut, it's got to be a perpendicular. It's got to be a straight up and down cut. You don't want it to bevel this way because that's going to make it to where parts of it are going to squish more than other parts, right? You also don't want it to bevel out that way because if you want to fit them into one another, like I'm going to do that because I made a tessellation. I really like MC Escher's work. So I would like to do that in some of my print work. It's important for me to be able to line these up right next to like the last printing. So whatever intention you have with this, be thoughtful about how you craft your stamp. This stuff cuts like really easily too with a nice sharp knife, so make sure you've got good tools and they're in good repair. I've had some students that will just like cut a channel out of here and then just leave it rough. Again, while that might work for some applications, it's not going to work if you really want tight registration, right? It's better if you just remove that information, all of this that would ink up, and then that way you have more latitude with what you can do with your plate block. Got really close here, so I need to be cautious. be very mindful of what you're doing when you're doing these things, because again, there's no going back once you have made a decision and taken an action. There's some things we can do to solve problems, but there is no such thing as erasing really with this. I'm getting really close there. Better back off on that one. Trying to do this was a bad idea. I should be pulling the other way. It works better with right-handedness. Oh, that's really tight. I'm probably just going to have to cut little increments out of that. Kind of box myself in with this shape. It's so tight and curvilinear that save these little bits too, because we're going to be doing some stuff later where we make our own brayers, and they could come in handy. Like if you want to carve little images on them and then attach them to something cylindrical, could be a cool way to handle it. It's a better strategy that time than the last one. Just going to kind of cut in here, get as close as I can. I'm mostly happy with that. And I can fine tune it later too when I proof it and see how happy I am. Okay, so my next step then is I need to secure a piece of masonite, right? You saw it earlier when I bent this thing, it just cracked really easily, right? It needs something sturdy on the back, just like the wood that you see on these things. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a masonite backing. Think about efficiency of space here, right? For whatever reason, I don't know why, it just seems like the human animal always thinks, well, I've got this space, I'll just stick this thing right in the middle, right? It's gonna be so much easier if you can get this super close to the edges, because when we use the bandsaw, or if you use like a little jigsaw or a scroll saw, or however you're gonna cut this out if you're at home, it's gonna be way less work for you, right? So what I do is I carefully trace around my information. And because mine's like fairly equilateral because it's a tessellation, I'm not too worried about knowing how it's going to go on, because it should go on in any direction. But if yours is, very asymmetrical, or it's got different qualities, you might want to write something on the back, like, maybe you can flip it like this and say, okay, well, this is, an X and this is an O. And then do the same thing here, so that when you're ready to adhere it, you know how it goes back on, right? So it's a registration process. Okay, so next step here is we are gonna head down to the wood shop. All right, so we're in the wood shop. What's gonna happen here is I'm gonna find the most efficient way to get in as tight as I can to these areas. When you're cutting, it's very important that you don't cut the black away. We want a little bit of hang over there. So like when I put my stamp on there, right, I traced around it. Think about the fact that there's a thickness element to that marker, right? So it's adding like, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch perhaps. We'd rather have that 1/8 of an inch there to help us seal the stamp on than not there. Plus, if you cut too much away, it's not gonna really provide the function that we need when it comes to backing and being strong. The other thing is you want to craft some sort of a handle, right? And that's going to be different for everybody depending on the shape of their block. For me, I just needed something that would fit like within here, right? I'm not worried about these not imparting enough pressure, but if I were, I would actually probably find a piece, and this is just scrap pine that we use for like, framing and stuff. I would probably try to find a piece that could go this way and this way. and then I would adhere that to the back. So I've cut this, it's just like an angled piece. I don't know, I kind of like the angled thing because that way you can pick it up, and when you push it, it imparts the pressure down that way. So what I'm gonna be doing is using the bandsaw. First thing I'm gonna do is zip this off, and then I'm gonna carefully work in and around. All right, so back in the classroom now, and what I'm doing is I'm checking for a good fit, right? I like to have a little shelf in here like I was talking about earlier because of the way that we need to sort of clamp this down with some hot glue. But I'm seeing right here that I maybe have a little excess, and this would have been something I probably should have caught in the wood shop. But I can come back to it later and I can like saw that off, or I could sand it off. Same thing here and here. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna get rid of all this business because I want this to be nice and clean, right? So when I do this, I try to sand from the back to the front just so I knock it off, right? I don't wanna hit it this way. I just wanna get it nice and crisp and clean. Like, I don't really care if there's a bunch of saw marks on here. This isn't about, you know, this isn't about making furniture or anything. It's about making a good, strong substrate that doesn't leave a bunch of chaff and wood, sawdust on your print or your ink. So kind of more or less just cleaning up that back stuff. Now, if it was really bad, we could use like if you have a lot that you need to sand off, we'll just use the belt sander in the wood shop. And like I did have like a mess up in here, right? It skipped a little bit, cut in. I think that is something I'll probably need to sand down just a little bit. So to speed that up, that's something I would probably hit with like 80. This is 220. I'm not gonna worry about going past that. We also have some files that you can use to kind of clean up the edges as well. All right, so I wanna make sure that there's no dust or anything on this. I want to do the same with this here, right? Because now we have to stick this down to this. And rubber's kind of difficult to stick down to things, but I've discovered that super glue works pretty well for this, as long as you don't use too much super glue, and as long as you don't mess with it after you've set it. I'm just going to grab some newsprint to work on top of. So the trial that I did for that is here. I just took one of the pieces that I cut out, and I added maybe, I don't know, 7 dots of glue to the back of this, and it's pretty sturdy. I did that maybe 20 minutes ago. One thing I did discover, and you can see that here, it's like what I tried to do was just glue it down, just boom, straight on there, a little bit of glue on this piece. I was able to pull it off, so it didn't really infiltrate into the block very well. So for this one, I actually did some shallow cuts on the back of it so that it could like seep into the rubber a little bit more. So that might be something I do here. But if you're gonna do this, please be careful, because you don't wanna go through all this work and then cut deeply and mess up your image or your matrix, right? So I'm just gonna kind of like barely sink my blade, just in kind of like a hatching pattern of some sort. Just something to open up the rubber just a little bit. Okay. know how it goes, right? Because super glue works fast. You only want to put this on one surface. So I'm going to put it on this surface. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to kind of like put a dot. Kind of go around the perimeter, put a few random dots in the middle. And as soon as I think I have enough to do the job, then I'm going to join these up. It's important that you move it around just a little bit, just to really get that super glue to like get into the rubber. I'm going to leave it alone now. This is when I usually mess things up. Like, oh, I want to check it. Ooh, let's see how well it's going. And then it pops back off, and you know, that's just the story of super glue. So what I'm going to do next at this point, right, once this is completely set up, then I'm going to use hot glue, okay? And the hot glue I'm going to use to create sort of a border in here that's going to glue up the sides a little bit. So if you think about it like this, like we have, this would represent the masonite. This would represent the rubber on top of the masonite. And yeah, while it's glued under here, it's really helpful to have something out here for two reasons, right? It's going to sort of hold it in a little bit more so that it's more sturdy and you can actually push more with it. But it's also going to make it to where ink doesn't seep into this area, which is going to be a pain in the butt to clean. It's a lot easier to clean ink off of hot glue, right? But you want to make sure that your super glue is completely set up before you do this. I'm going to grab a card real quick. And please be careful with this. I know it's like hot glue 101, but you know, I hurt myself all the time with hot glue. So here's kind of the way that I do that. Like I'm going to run a bead. I'm just going to kind of let that sit for just a second. If I think that that's solid enough, like, you know, I didn't make it messy, I can let that set up and cool. But if I feel like I need to spread it a little bit, I can certainly do that. But please use a card, don't use your fingers. Looks like it's not going to go anywhere, so I'll just move my way around now. So again, this is the purpose for that extra ledge that we put on there, or left on there rather. I don't want to leave a lot of extra nasty on there though, so you want it clean, otherwise when you're inking and all that stuff, it's going to pose an issue for you. Hot glue is a fascinating thing. I've done so much with it. In a pinch, I've discovered that hot glue can be helpful in plumbing applications, although not very permanent. It's our artist's best friend. I'm probably going to go back and just like ensure that I got my tips sealed up as well, because again, that's going to be a point where ink is going to try to stick into the wood and or under the block. That's going to cause some issues. Note that I put the stamp on the smooth side of the masonite. We want the rough side of the masonite to be where we put the handle, because that's going to hold a lot of glue and it's going to make a nice sturdy handle seam. You may find that you have to go back and do this again if it starts to break down in the process of you using it. Just like with anything else in art making, right? Craftsmanship is important. A little bit of extra time now worrying about craftsmanship is going to make it to where you have far less headaches later when you're actually ready to print. I want ink shooting out of areas that it shouldn't be in. Just about there. That one's real close. Like in this case, I don't have much of a shelf. So what I'm going to do is try to like bond it to whatever I can that I can access in terms of the masonite there. Like I want to be able to actually have it touch the masonite. Even though I need to cut this off here, I'm going to go ahead and just glue it on just to seal the tip. And I can come back to it later and cut it. But I'm really excited to proof this thing, so we'll see what happens. Okay. Whoops. It's imperative to make sure that you don't have a bunch of these glue stringer things. So after it's cool and you're good to go, pick all that business off so that you have a nice clean stamp. Okay. There's two ways to adhere our handle, right? If you're at the end of a day and you have time to kill or whatever, like you're not going to print it right away, we'll just break out some wood glue and seal it up on both sides and just let it dry for a day. But if you're in a big hurry to go ahead and print, like I usually am, I'm just going to put a bunch of hot glue on the back. And then when I squeeze it in, I want to make sure that I squeeze it such that it's really pushed into all those little textural areas, right? And I'm just going to let that cool for a while. So while that's cooling, I'm going to go ahead and set up my ink slabs over here so that I can begin the printing process. You may want to try some black proofs at first before you move into color, and that's fine. I'm going to jump straight into color because it's like the same process. We're just using color instead. We're using an oil-based ink here. The reason we're using oil-based ink for this, and we'll clean it up with veggie oil and glass cleaner, so we don't have to use solvents, right? But the reason we're going to use oil-based ink is that we're going to be printing dry, right? So we're going to print on dry paper. We need that ink to make sure it doesn't like dry out in the process of inking, rolling, and then printing. So oil-based ink is the way to go, right? Your water-based ink dries out like right away, and you'd have to like reactivate it with water or something, or like perhaps a wet paper, and it's going to be far less. Ooh, that's really, really thick. Might have to add a little burnt plate oil to that. It's going to be far less easy to register and print. So when we start doing mixed prints and stuff, we start mixing techniques, it's important to think about order of operations, and I'll be really emphasizing that. We're going to be doing some wet process. We're going to be doing some dry processes. Some are going to agree with others better, right? So like depending on how you're going to mix up your media, we have to develop some sort of a plan that's going to be unique to what you want to do. That one I think I need a little burnt plate oil for. So we can add a little bit of oil to an ink that's really dry. It's not going to take much because I have a very small amount of ink. Ideally I would use an ink knife for this. But I have this card and it's pretty sturdy, so I think I'm just going to use that. It'll make my cleanup a little easier. So I'm just going to pick that ink up. I may have put a little too much oil in that, but we'll see how it goes. This is the same oil that we're going to be using for the paper lithography techniques. So try to keep it simple without a lot of chemistry. I'm going to really have to work this slab to get it nice and consistent. In this case, I might want to use an ink knife, pull it back up, and just try to lay out a cleaner bead. But I think for the purpose of proofing, I'll be all right. Okay. This should be ready by now. One thing that is going to happen, if I use the yellow, sometimes the red, because they're lighter colors, if I have Sharpie left on here, sometimes that'll like move into the ink and print onto the paper. So if you don't like that, doing a couple of proofs first on like trash paper and then moving to good paper will kind of help get rid of that. You want to make sure that there's no chaff, debris, or anything in here. Usually we use a stiff brush to kind of brush it every direction. So I'm going to grab one just because I know that I haven't done that process yet. Like, I always like to get really stiff bristles for that. So if there's anything left in these lines, this is going to get it out so it doesn't contaminate the ink. If there's any wood, sawdust, anything like that, it doesn't contaminate the print. Okay. So I built, or I designed rather, a rotational tessellation, right? So that means that the pattern that I created on one side will fit all the way around. So if I wanted to, and of course, by all means, you certainly don't have to use the tessellation. Whatever kind of pattern design you want to develop, that's fine. I just really love MC Escher's work. I like the way that it creates pattern that can either be pushed away, and it can sort of regularize things, or it could be very decorative if that's what I want to do with my work. So if I knew I wanted these to fit in, it might be a good idea for me to lay it down, trace it lightly with a pencil, right? That way I kind of know how I can organize it. For now, I'm just going to be pulling some proofs. So when we do this, it's a smart idea to have something cushiony underneath. You don't need a lot of blanket type stuff. We could use the felt that we normally use for other purposes because it's nice and compact. Probably wouldn't use the thick pusher blankets, but here I'm just using a towel and I just have it folded over, right? We need a little bit of that so that when we push this in, there's some give for the paper. Sometimes you'll find that you don't need that. It's all about experimentation. So I'm going to start with this yellow just to kind of see. So you're going to have to hold the block, right? Don't think that you can set it down and ink it. It's just not going to work that way. We want to exaggerate the amount of ink that we would put on here because we're not using press pressure, right? Everything that we're doing is hand printing. So we have to modify processes so that it's more agreeable to hand printing. One of the things that I found is exaggerating the amount of ink you use because that way you're more likely to get the dark print that you want instead of a light print. So I'm going to ink it up like 4, 5, 6 times. I'm charging up in between because I could roll on this all day and it's not going to do anything. You have to pull ink from one side to put it to the other. Now I'm going to give it a shot. Probably going to lose the gloves at this point. Flip that over. So it's a pretty good example of what I was talking about earlier, right, with that black coming through the yellow. But I don't know, it doesn't really bother me. So when you do this, when you create your proof for this, the hand stamping, I want repetition involved. Again, it doesn't have to be tessellation, right? But I want you to experiment with using different colors to build like a field of imagery kind of thing. So I don't just want this as a proof, right? That wouldn't cut it for me. That's a beautiful thing about printmaking is that repetition is super easy to pull off because you have these matrices that you can reuse over and over again. And again, if I weren't happy with the way that proof came out, I could clean my block off and I could go back and I could cut more out. Okay. So your first proofing, you want to exaggerate the amount of ink for sure. Let's see here. It's going to fit like this. No, it's not. It's going to fit like... Yeah, I should have registered my stuff. I really wanted to get them close in next to each other. For sure. I think what I'm going to try is this. Just get a little separation between them. Once you've committed, it's there, okay? So like plan it out well. Don't think you can like just place it on there and then, oh, I don't like that. I'll pick it up because it's going to make a mark. And I'm being really mindful not to get ink everywhere, right? Because the less mess I make, the easier it's going to be to clean up later. It's going to kind of I've made stamps that are 4 or 5 years old and they're still holding up and they're still doing great things. So again, if you have good craftsmanship, I'm going to move to some red now. Actually, I think what I'll do is a split. I think I'm going to ink up one half in yellow. I'm going to emphasize yellow on this half. I'm just going to play with some red on this side. Of course, yes, this is going to mix colors, right? So like, depending on what other people might want to do in class, you might want to kind of confer and decide, like, if you want an orange, you're going to mix an orange, right? We do all that stuff by hand. Be careful not to touch this ink. It's going to be wet for about a day. It's got to soak into the paper. I dig that quite a bit. Very happy with that. I'm going to be careful not to get too much red in my yellow brayer. But you know, it happens, right? And if that happens, we clean it up. I don't want you to feel like you can't experiment. Oh, it's kind of touching that other one. Oh well. And I think on this one, just a small amount of yellow, and I'm going to try to dominate with that red. This is a really useful thing for graphic designers, FYI graphic designers. And moving from yellow to red is easy, right? So that's why I didn't start with red and then move to yellow. Think about your primary colors and how they work. You can dominate yellow super easily with red, but you can't really go the other way. So if you were going to use primary colors like that, again, it's all about strategy and being mindful about your choices. Next thing I'm going to show you is some proof-off prints. So if I wanted to manipulate the intensity of the color, I could do a proof-off. So I've got a nice heavy red there. That means I've got, you know, far less ink on this. And if I wanted to, I could kind of create a fade. So without inking it up again, I'm just going to move over here on this pile of paper just because I know I'm probably going to print on my... Go. And each time that I do that without inking it up, it's going to get lighter and lighter. Also think about maybe experimenting with going off the page. Don't be so respectful of the borders, right? Kind of look like those little whirligig things that happen in the... Just going to start adding these just to kind of get a little bit of continuity in there. So this kind of serves a two-tail function. One, it produces a nice low saturated image with the repetition, but two, you're kind of cleaning your block off. I'm pretty happy with that print. Okay. So it's really important that you don't stack anything on top of this when you're finished, right? So this kind of thing would either go like in your storage container with nothing else on top, or you might pin it up onto the walls until it has a chance to thoroughly dry. And what I do to check that is just put a clean finger on there, and if I get any ink, I need to let it go longer. Cleanup is super easy. We take trash paper, usually newsprint, and we just start stamping everywhere, all over the place. And you'll see a little bit of a remnant in there, right? If you got messy, like I did, and maybe got some on the sides, just try to wipe off as much as you can first with either the rags or the shop towels. Go with the rags first, they're cheap. Shop towels are expensive and more useful than rags. Okay. Next stage in cleaning this is we're going to use some vegetable oil. Where's my veggie oil? There it is. Same way that we would clean up our slabs. I'm going to put a little bit on, just a little tiny bit on this rag, the shop towel thing. Then I'm just going to kind of work it over the surface. I'm not scrubbing heavy. I'm just kind of wiping, right? And that kind of gets the rest of the ink off of there. It's awesome that we can use vegetable oil and that it works with oil-based inks, because my experience with printmaking was mostly solvent-oriented. I remember going home with headaches all the time, thinking, ooh, how long can I keep this up, you know? Now, we don't want to leave our block oily, right? So you notice when I was cleaning this, I didn't spray this directly on here. If you spray that directly on there, it's going to get in the grooves. It's going to stay in there. It's going to be nasty. You're going to have a hard time printing it later, right? So always put it on the rag to wipe off. Then we have to get the grease off of it, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a degreasing dish soap, right? Ajax is what I like to use. I got a little bit more over here, so I'm going to bring it. Now the slabs, the glass slabs, what we do with that is we actually put glass cleaner on that to get the grease up. But with this, we just use a little bit of dish soap, degreasing dish soap and water. And this is, again, a great reason to have a super sealed up stamp, because we don't want that wood absorbing all that water and soap. We want to be able to get it as clean as possible each time. Do not just leave your ink on the surface, by the way. Once it dries, you're going to have a really hard time getting it off. Just give it a rinse. If you're really picky about that wood, right, before you start even using it, you could like soak this in polyurethane and that would make it waterproof. So now I just let this sit out and dry and I'm ready to use it again. So that's stamp making.